What if I told you that one of history's most powerful rulers committed what we would consider today an unthinkable act? That a pharaoh of ancient Egypt, considered a living god by his people, married his own daughter and made her his queen. You might think this sounds like something out of a twisted fantasy novel, but this actually happened in the land of the pyramids over 3,000 years ago. Today, we're diving deep into one of ancient Egypt's most shocking and controversial stories, the tale of Ramesses II, also known as Ramesses the Great, who ruled Egypt for an incredible 66 years and left behind a legacy that still captivates us today. But among all his achievements, his military victories, and his massive building projects, there's one aspect of his reign that historians have debated for decades, and it involves his relationship with his own daughter. Now, before we get into this mind-bending story, I want you to understand something crucial. We're not just talking about any ordinary king here. Ramesses II wasn't just a ruler. He was considered a living god on earth by the ancient Egyptians. Everything he did was believed to be divinely ordained, including his marriages. But even by ancient Egyptian standards, what he did was extraordinary and controversial. The ancient Egyptians had a completely different worldview than we do today. They believed their pharaohs were literally the earthly embodiment of the god Horus, and after death, they would become Osiris. This divine status meant that pharaohs operated by different rules than ordinary mortals. They could do things that would be absolutely unacceptable for anyone else, and their subjects would not only accept it, but actually celebrate it as the will of the gods. But here's where it gets really interesting. Even in ancient Egypt, where royal incest wasn't completely unheard of, the practice of a pharaoh marrying his own daughter was still rare and shocking. Most pharaohs who practiced incest married their sisters or half-sisters, following the example of the gods Osiris and Isis, who were siblings and spouses. But marrying one's own daughter, that was taking divine privilege to a whole new level. Ramesses II ruled Egypt from 1279 to 1213 BCE, during what historians call the New Kingdom period. This was ancient Egypt at its absolute peak, wealthy, powerful, and influential throughout the known world. Ramesses came to power when he was probably in his early 20s, and he would go on to become one of the most successful pharaohs in Egyptian history. He expanded Egypt's empire, built incredible monuments that still stand today, and lived to the remarkable age of around 90, in an era when most people died before 40. During his long reign, Ramesses II had multiple wives, which was completely normal for pharaohs of his time. In fact, having many wives was seen as a sign of power and helped cement political alliances with other kingdoms. His principal wife was Nefertari, who is often considered one of the most beautiful and powerful queens in Egyptian history. He built an entire temple for her at Abu Simbel, right next to his own massive temple, which tells us just how much he valued her. But Nefertari died relatively early in Ramesses' reign, probably around year 25 of his rule. After her death, Ramesses elevated several of his other wives to more prominent positions. And this is where our story takes its shocking turn, because among the women he chose to elevate was his own daughter. Now, you might be wondering how we know about this. After all, this happened over 3,000 years ago, and it's not exactly the kind of thing that ancient Egyptian scribes would have written about casually in their records. The evidence comes from several sources, including inscriptions on monuments, papyrus documents, and archaeological discoveries that have allowed Egyptologists to piece together this incredible story. The daughter in question was named Meritamen, and she was one of Ramesses II's children with Nefertari. Ancient Egyptian records show that after Nefertari's death, Meritamen began appearing in official royal inscriptions with titles that were typically reserved for queens, not princesses. She was given the title King's Great Wife, which was the highest rank a woman could hold in ancient Egypt, typically reserved for the pharaoh's principal queen. But here's what makes this even more complex and fascinating. In ancient Egypt, marriage wasn't just about personal relationships or even political alliances. It was deeply tied to religious beliefs and the maintenance of cosmic order, or what the Egyptians called Ma'at. The pharaoh's marriages were seen as essential to maintaining the balance of the universe and ensuring the continued prosperity of Egypt. The ancient Egyptians believed that their gods had set the example for royal behavior. Since Osiris had married his sister Isis, it was acceptable, and even preferred for pharaohs to marry within their own family, to keep the divine bloodline pure. But the marriage of a father to his daughter was different. This was not just about keeping the bloodline pure. This was about something much more profound and disturbing. What we're about to explore together is not just a story about one man's controversial personal choices. It's a window into an ancient world where the rules of morality, religion, and power operated in ways that are almost impossible for us to understand today. It's a story that reveals the absolute nature of pharaonic power and the lengths to which ancient Egyptian rulers would go to maintain their divine status. So buckle up, because we're about to journey back over 3 millennia to explore one of history's most shocking royal scandals. And trust me, the truth is stranger and more complex than you could ever imagine. To understand how something as shocking as a pharaoh marrying his daughter could happen, we need to step into the sandals of the ancient Egyptians and see the world through their eyes. And let me tell you, their world was nothing like ours. Picture this. It's around 1250 BCE, and you're standing on the banks of the Nile River in ancient Thebes, the magnificent capital of the Egyptian Empire. The air is filled with the scent of incense from countless temples, and the sound of chisels on stone echoes throughout the city, as workers carve hieroglyphs into massive monuments. Everywhere you look, there are images of one man, Ramesses II, depicted as tall as the gods themselves, sometimes literally shown standing shoulder to shoulder with deities. This wasn't just royal propaganda. The ancient Egyptians genuinely believed that their pharaoh was a living god. Not like a god, not chosen by God, but literally a god in human form. When Ramesses II walked through the streets of Memphis or Thebes, people didn't just show respect. They were in the presence of divinity itself. Children were brought forward to be blessed by his touch, and simply seeing the pharaoh was considered a religious experience that could bring good fortune for a lifetime. But being a god king came with responsibilities that we can barely comprehend today. Ramesses wasn't just responsible for ruling Egypt. He was responsible for keeping the entire universe in balance. The ancient Egyptians believed that if the pharaoh failed in his duties, the Nile might not flood, the sun might not rise, and chaos would consume the world. No pressure, right? This is where the concept of Mayat becomes crucial to our story. Mayat was the ancient Egyptian principle of truth, justice, harmony, and cosmic order. It wasn't just a philosophical concept. It was personified as a goddess with a feather in her hair, and maintaining Ma'at was the pharaoh's most sacred duty. Everything the pharaoh did, from the wars he fought to the temples he built to the women he married, had to serve the purpose of maintaining cosmic harmony. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. The ancient Egyptian creation myths told stories of gods marrying their own family members to maintain divine purity. The most important of these stories involved Osiris and Isis, who were both siblings and spouses. Their brother Set was also married to their sister Nephthys. These weren't seen as scandalous relationships. They were the divine template for how godly bloodlines should be preserved. But the gods had also set another precedent that's crucial to our story. In some versions of Egyptian mythology, the sun god Ra had relationships with his own daughters. The goddess Hathor was sometimes described as both the daughter and the wife of Ra. To ancient Egyptian minds, if the supreme god could have such a relationship with his daughter, then perhaps a pharaoh, as a living god, could do the same. Ramesses II took these divine precedents very seriously. Throughout his reign, he consistently portrayed himself not just as a servant of the gods, but as their equal. His temples didn't just honor the traditional Egyptian deities. They included statues of Ramesses himself receiving worship alongside gods like Amun-Ra and Ptah. He literally had himself deified while he was still alive, something that was extremely rare even among pharaohs. This deification wasn't just ego, it was a calculated political and religious strategy. Egypt in Ramesses' time was facing threats from powerful enemies like the Hittites and the Sea Peoples. The empire was vast and difficult to control, stretching from Nubia in the south to parts of modern-day Syria in the north. To maintain control over such a diverse and far-flung empire, Ramesses needed his subjects to see him as more than just a powerful king. He needed them to see him as a god whose word was literally divine law. The royal court of Ramesses II was like nothing we can imagine today. Imagine a world where hundreds of wives, concubines, children, and courtiers all revolved around one man who was considered divine. The pharaoh's personal life wasn't personal at all. It was a matter of state religion. Every marriage was a sacred act that helped maintain the cosmic order, and every child born to the pharaoh was seen as a gift from the gods to the Egyptian people. Ramesses had over 100 children, with his various wives and concubines. That might sound excessive to us, but to the ancient Egyptians, it was proof of the pharaoh's divine virility and the gods' favor. Each child was a potential heir to the throne, a diplomatic asset for marriage alliances, or a priest or priestess who could serve in the temples. In the royal family, children weren't just loved family members. They were valuable resources for maintaining Egypt as power and religious purity. The royal women in Ramesses' court held positions of incredible influence, but their power was always tied to their relationship with the pharaoh. The king's great wife, the principal queen, wasn't just a spouse. She was a vital religious figure who participated in temple rituals and was often seen as the earthly embodiment of various goddesses. When Nefertari held this position, she was depicted in temple reliefs performing religious ceremonies alongside Ramesses, showing that she was considered almost as divine as the pharaoh himself. But here's what's really important to understand. In this world of absolute divine monarchy, normal human relationships and normal human emotions had to take a backseat to the demands of maintaining cosmic order. Love, personal preference, and individual happiness were luxuries that gods couldn't afford. Every decision the pharaoh made about marriage and family had to serve the higher purpose of keeping Mahat in balance. This is the world in which Ramesses II made his shocking decision to elevate his daughter Meritamen to the position of queen. It wasn't a world where personal morality as we understand it today had much meaning. It was a world where the pharaoh's divine nature meant that whatever he did was, by definition, the will of the gods. Now we come to the heart of our story, and I have to warn you, the evidence for what happened between Ramesses II and his daughter is both fascinating and deeply disturbing. We're not talking about some wild conspiracy theory or sensationalized tabloid story. This is serious historical research based on archaeological evidence, ancient inscriptions, and careful scholarly analysis that has taken decades to piece together. The key figure in this story is Meritamen, whose name means beloved of Amun. She was one of the daughters of Ramesses II and his beloved queen Nefertari. Now, we don't know exactly when Meritamen was born, but based on the chronology of Ramesses' reign, and the evidence we have, she was probably born sometime in the first decade of his rule, which would make her around 15 to 20 years old, when the events we're discussing took place. Here's where the evidence gets really compelling. After Nefertari died around year 25 of Ramesses' reign, something very unusual started happening in the official royal records. Meritamen began appearing in inscriptions and reliefs with titles that were previously held only by Nefertari. She was given the title King's Great Wife, the highest rank a woman could achieve in ancient Egypt, essentially making her the new queen of Egypt. But wait, there's more. In the temple of Abu Simbel, which Ramesses built to commemorate his victory at the Battle of Kadesh, there are reliefs showing Meritamen standing behind the pharaoh in the exact same position that was traditionally reserved for the principal queen. She's depicted wearing the distinctive crown of a queen, complete with the double uraeus, the twin cobra symbols that represented the pharaoh's power over Upper and Lower Egypt. Even more telling are the inscriptions found in various temples throughout Egypt. In these hieroglyphic texts, Meritamen is referred to not just as king's daughter, but simultaneously as king's great wife. Think about that for a moment. The same person is being called both the pharaoh's daughter and his principal wife in official state documents. This wasn't a mistake or an oversight. Ancient Egyptian scribes were incredibly careful about royal titles, and these inscriptions were carved in stone to last for eternity. One of the most significant pieces of evidence comes from a papyrus document discovered in the 20th century that lists the royal family members and their relationships. In this document, Meritamen is clearly identified as both a daughter of Rameses II, Prestes, and as holding the position typically occupied by his primary queen. The papyrus even includes details about religious ceremonies where she participated as queen, performing rituals that were traditionally the domain of the pharaoh's wife. Archaeological evidence from the Valley of the Queens also supports this shocking relationship. Meritamen was given a tomb in this royal necropolis that was decorated in a style typically reserved for queens, not princesses. The artwork in her tomb shows her receiving honors from various gods, and she's depicted wearing the regalia of a queen rather than a princess. Most tellingly, some of the inscriptions in her tomb refer to her relationship with Rameses in language that's typically used to describe husband and wife relationships. But perhaps the most disturbing evidence comes from what happened after Meritamen. She wasn't the only daughter that Rameses II set. Winun elevated to queen status. Historical records suggest that he also married at least 2 other daughters, Bintanath and Nebetawe. Bintanath, whose name means daughter of Anath, after a Canaanite goddess, appears in records with the same dual titles of king's daughter and king's wife. Like Meritamen, she was given a tomb in the Valley of the Queens, decorated as befitted a queen rather than a princess. Now, you might be wondering, how do we know these were actually marriages and not just honorary titles? After all, maybe Rameses was just honoring his daughters with fancy titles without actually marrying them. Unfortunately, the evidence suggests otherwise. Ancient Egyptian marriage contracts and religious texts make it clear that the title king's great wife carried specific legal and religious obligations that went far beyond honorary recognition. The title came with actual queenly duties, including participating in religious festivals as the pharaoh's consort, managing certain aspects of the royal household, and serving as a priestess in temples, where the queen was expected to perform rituals alongside her husband. These weren't ceremonial roles. They were active, ongoing responsibilities that required the queen to function as the pharaoh's partner in both religious and administrative matters. Moreover, ancient Egyptian royal marriages were always accompanied by specific religious ceremonies and legal formalities. The elevation of these daughters to queen status appears to have followed the same patterns as Ramesses' other marriages, complete with formal announcements, religious ceremonies, and the assignment of royal estates and servants to support their new status. What makes this even more complex is that these marriages seem to have occurred at different times throughout Ramesses' reign. Meritamen was elevated to queen status first, probably around year 30 of his reign. Bintanath appears to have been given queen status later, possibly around year 40. This suggests that these weren't desperate political moves made in crisis, but calculated decisions made over many years. The timing is also significant because it coincides with Ramesses' increasing emphasis on his own divinity. As his reign progressed, Rameses became more and more focused on portraying himself as a god equal to the traditional Egyptian deities. These marriages to his daughters can be seen as the ultimate expression of his divine status. After all, if he truly was a god like Ra, then perhaps he could follow the same patterns of divine relationships that existed in Egyptian mythology. It's important to note that these relationships were never hidden or kept secret. Unlike scandals in other royal courts throughout history, Ramesses' marriages to his daughters were publicly announced, officially recorded, and celebrated in temples throughout Egypt. This wasn't a shameful secret. It was presented as evidence of the pharaoh, his divine nature, and his special relationship with the gods. The ancient Egyptian people seem to have accepted these marriages without major controversy, at least based on the historical record we have. This tells us something important about how different their worldview was from ours, and how completely they accepted the idea that their pharaoh operated by different moral rules than ordinary humans. The marriages between Rameses II and his daughters weren't just personal relationships. They were profound religious and political statements that shook the very foundations of ancient Egyptian society. To understand why these marriages happened and what they meant, we need to dive deep into the complex web of religion, politics, and power that defined ancient Egypt. First, let's talk about the religious implications, because in ancient Egypt, you couldn't separate politics from religion. Everything was interconnected. When Ramesses married his daughters, he was making a bold theological statement. He was claiming to be not just a god, but a god of the same caliber as Ra, the supreme solar deity who, according to some myths, had intimate relationships with his own daughters. In Egyptian mythology, Ra was said to have created other gods through various means, including relationships with deities who were both his daughters and his consorts. The goddess Hathor, for example, was sometimes described as the daughter of Ra, sometimes as his wife, and sometimes as both simultaneously. By following this mythological pattern, Ramesses was essentially saying, I am not just divinely appointed, I am divine in the same way that Ra is divine. This was an incredibly audacious claim. Most pharaohs were content to be seen as the earthly representative of the gods, or as the son of Ra. But Ramesses was positioning himself as Ra's equal, capable of the same divine relationships and the same cosmic responsibilities. This wasn't just religious innovation, it was religious revolution. The political implications were equally massive. By the time Ramesses made these marriages, he had been ruling Egypt for several decades, and he was facing some serious challenges. The Hittite Empire in the north remained a constant threat despite the famous peace treaty. Various Nubian tribes in the south were becoming increasingly restless. And perhaps most importantly, Egypt's massive empire was becoming increasingly difficult to manage through traditional means. Ancient Egypt was held together by the divine authority of the pharaoh, but that authority had to be constantly reinforced and demonstrated. By marrying his daughters, Ramesses was making the ultimate demonstration of his divine status. He was showing his subjects, his enemies, and his own court that he operated by rules that were completely different from those that governed ordinary mortals, even ordinary kings. Think about it from a political perspective. If you were a provincial governor in some distant part of the Egyptian empire, and you heard that the pharaoh had married his own daughters, something that even most gods didn't do, how would that affect your willingness to rebel against him? It would send a clear message. This is not a man you want to cross, because he's operating on a completely different level of divine authority. But the marriages also served another crucial political function. They solved the problem of succession. By Ramesses' later years, he had outlived many of his sons who would normally have been expected to inherit the throne. His extremely long reign meant that the normal patterns of royal succession were becoming complicated. By elevating his daughters to queen status, he was creating a new model for royal authority that could potentially be passed down through the female line. This wasn't unprecedented in Egyptian history. Some of the most successful pharaohs had been women, like Hatshepsut, who ruled for over 20 years during the New Kingdom period. By making his daughters queens, Ramesses might have been preparing for the possibility that one of them could rule Egypt in her own right, if necessary. The religious establishment's response to these marriages is fascinating and tells us a lot about how power worked in ancient Egypt. You might expect that the priests would have been outraged by what Ramesses was doing, but the historical evidence suggests otherwise. The major temples continued to support Ramesses throughout his reign, and many of them actually incorporated these new royal relationships into their religious ceremonies and festivals. This acceptance by the priesthood was crucial because the temples were not just religious institutions. They were major economic and political players in ancient Egypt. The priests controlled vast amounts of land, supervised large numbers of workers, and played essential roles in legitimizing the pharaoh's authority. If they had opposed Ramesses' marriages to his daughters, it could have created a serious political crisis. Instead, the priests seem to have embraced these relationships as evidence of the pharaoh's special divine nature. Temple inscriptions from this period describe Ramesses in increasingly godlike terms, and some temples even began worshipping him directly alongside the traditional Egyptian deities. The marriages to his daughters became part of the religious narrative that portrayed Ramesses as a living god worthy of worship. The international implications were also significant. Ancient Egypt didn't exist in isolation. It was part of a complex web of diplomatic relationships with other major powers like the Hittite Empire, Assyria, and various Mesopotamian kingdoms. When news of Ramesses' marriages to his daughters spread beyond Egypt's borders, it sent a clear message about Egyptian power and Egyptian exceptionalism. Foreign diplomats and rulers would have understood that they were dealing with a pharaoh who claimed an unprecedented level of divine authority. This could be both intimidating and useful in negotiations. After all, how do you negotiate with someone who claims to be operating by divine rules that don't apply to anyone else? But perhaps most importantly, these marriages represented the logical extreme of the pharaonic system itself. For over 1,000 years before Ramesses II, Egyptian pharaohs had been gradually expanding their claims to divine authority. They had moved from being servants of the gods to being sons of the gods to being living embodiments of the gods. Ramesses' marriages to his daughters represented the final step in this evolution. The claim to be a god whose divine nature allowed him to transcend even the moral boundaries that applied to other pharaohs. In many ways, these marriages were both the peak of pharaonic power and the beginning of its decline. They represented the moment when the pharaoh's divine claims became so extreme that they began to disconnect from the practical realities of governing an empire. Future pharaohs would struggle to match Ramesses' claims to divinity, and the pharaonic system would gradually become less effective as a result. The marriages between Ramesses and his daughters weren't just shocking personal relationships. They were the climax of one of history's most extraordinary experiments in divine kingship. So what happened next? How did these shocking marriages affect the course of Egyptian history? And what can they teach us about power, religion, and human nature? The answers to these questions reveal some of the most profound lessons we can learn from this extraordinary story. First, let's talk about what happened to the daughters themselves. Meritamen, Bintanath, and Nebetawi all lived out their lives as queens of Egypt, but their stories after becoming queens are surprisingly difficult to trace. This tells us something important about how these relationships actually functioned in practice. Despite holding the title of king's great wife, these daughter queens do not appear to have played the same active role in Egyptian politics and religion that Nefertari had during her time as queen. Nefertari was depicted constantly alongside Ramesses in temple reliefs, appeared in diplomatic correspondence, and clearly wielded significant influence over royal policy. The daughter queens, by contrast, seem to have been more symbolic figures than active participants in governance. This suggests that these marriages were primarily about religious and political symbolism, rather than practical partnership. Ramesses wasn't looking for new political advisors or administrative partners when he married his daughters. He was making a statement about his divine nature that was intended for both domestic and international audiences. The succession question that these marriages were partly meant to address ultimately resolved itself in a different way. Ramesses II lived so long that he outlived 12 of his sons before finally being succeeded by Merneptah, who was probably his 13th son. None of his daughter queens ever ruled Egypt in their own right, despite the precedent their queenly status might have established. But the real impact of these marriages goes far beyond the immediate political consequences. They represented a turning point in how pharaonic power was conceived and exercised. After Ramesses II, no other pharaoh ever made such extreme claims to divinity, and none ever followed his example of marrying their own daughters. This wasn't because later pharaohs were more moral or less ambitious than Ramesses. It was because Ramesses had pushed the concept of divine kingship to its absolute limit, and what happened next showed that there were practical boundaries to how far such claims could be taken. The generation of pharaohs who came after Ramesses inherited an empire that was increasingly difficult to govern. Egypt's enemies had learned to adapt to Egyptian military tactics. The empire's vast territories were becoming more expensive to maintain than they were worth, and the Egyptian people were growing weary of the massive building projects and military campaigns that had defined Ramesses' reign. More importantly, Ramesses' extreme claims to divinity had created a new problem. How could his successors possibly match his divine status? If the pharaoh was supposed to be a living god equal to Ra himself, then what happened when that pharaoh died and was replaced by someone who was obviously less impressive? This is what historians call the succession crisis of divine kingship. When you claim to be a god, you create expectations that are almost impossible for your successors to meet. Ramesses II had been such a dominant figure, ruling for so long and making such extraordinary claims about his divine nature, that anyone who came after him would inevitably seem disappointing by comparison. The pharaohs who followed Ramesses tried various strategies to deal with this problem. Some emphasized their military prowess, others focused on building projects, and still others tried to associate themselves as closely as possible with Ramesses' memory. But none of them ever achieved the same level of absolute authority that Ramesses had wielded, and none of them ever attempted to marry their own daughters. The decline of the new kingdom that began shortly after Ramesses' death wasn't caused solely by his marriages to his daughters. But those marriages were a symptom of the broader problems that would eventually bring down the pharaonic system. When a ruler has to make increasingly extreme claims to maintain his authority, it's often a sign that the traditional sources of that authority are beginning to fail. From a modern perspective, the story of Ramesses and his daughters raises profound questions about the nature of absolute power and its effects on human behavior. Here was a man who had everything: wealth, power, military success, and the genuine worship of millions of people. Yet he still felt compelled to make increasingly extreme demonstrations of his divine status, ultimately crossing boundaries that even his own culture found shocking. This pattern is disturbingly familiar to anyone who studies the history of absolute monarchy and dictatorship. Time and again, we see rulers who start with a legitimate authority gradually become consumed by the need to prove their exceptional nature, often in ways that ultimately undermine the very foundations of their power. The story also reveals something important about how societies justify and rationalize the behavior of their leaders. The ancient Egyptians were able to accept Ramesses' marriages to his daughters because their entire worldview was built around the concept of pharaonic divinity. Once you accept that your ruler is literally a god, it becomes much easier to justify behavior that would be completely unacceptable from anyone else. This has obvious implications for how we think about political authority in our own time. While few modern leaders claim to be gods, many do claim various forms of exceptionalism, whether based on ideology, nationalism, or personal charisma, that are used to justify actions that would be condemned if performed by ordinary citizens. Perhaps most importantly, the story of Ramesses and his daughters reminds us that even the most powerful people in history were still human beings, subject to the same psychological drives and moral failings that affect all of us. The difference is that when ordinary people make bad decisions, the consequences are usually limited to their immediate circle. When pharaohs make bad decisions, those consequences can echo through history for thousands of years. Today, as we look back on this incredible story, from the perspective of over 3 millennia, we can see it both as a fascinating glimpse into a completely different world, and as a timeless cautionary tale about the corrupting effects of absolute power. The pharaoh who married his own daughter wasn't just making personal choices. He was showing us what happens when human ambition meets unlimited authority, and the results are both fascinating and deeply troubling. The legacy of Ramesses II includes many remarkable achievements, but perhaps none more remarkable than this shocking demonstration of how far human beings will go when they believe themselves to be above the moral laws that govern everyone else.